Welcome, everybody. This is the Asian American Chamber of Commerce 2022 GovCon Trends. This has been certainly a big year in government contracting with the government's response to the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, various vaccine mandates, a new contractor minimum wage, the end of the Jedi Procurement, and less exotically, we've seen that one-party control hasn't prevented the usual budget drama in Congress. We've seen confused navigation of the All Small Mentor Protege program, or JV program, and certainly its effect on contract competition such as CIO SP4. Similarly, we've seen challenges around the award of strategic sourcing vehicles, a rebalancing of small business versus category management. So we will cover all of these trends, all of these topics, and your questions in this event. I am thrilled to be joined by two luminaries in federal procurement. Larry Allen, the president of Allen Federal Business Partners. Larry led the Coalition for Government Procurement for 20 years, a leading nonprofit association of government contractors, focused also on GSA schedule issues. He's written numerous articles and appears on Federal News Radio's Government Matters. Also joining us is Rob Wong, who recently returned to FedResolve to lead small business growth strategy from serving as the associate administrator at the Small Business Administration, leading small business contracting industry for the United States. He's worked across our industry to improve the usefulness of the various federal certifications, such as 8A and Hubzone, and strengthen protections for small business. Rob started his career with SBA as an attorney, where he was counsel to the 8A program, which is certainly something of interest to many of us. So we are going to begin with a presentation kind of covering the topics of the last year, and then we will engage in discussion. We're very interested in hearing your questions, challenges, and experiences over the last year, and what you need to know as you move ahead to 2022. So turning it over to Larry.
Great, thanks very much, Jason, and it's a real treat to be with you all today. I'm glad we can get together at least virtually, and hopefully it won't be too long before we can do it in person. Whether you're in federal government business or are new to it, federal government business is equal parts relationship driven as it is process driven. And it's the relationships that really, I think, have suffered over the last couple of years. And hopefully we'll get back to being in person with our government colleagues more frequently so we can develop new relationships and strengthen the ones we have. But let's start at the top. Show me the money. Where are we with money, Larry? Well, right now, the government is still operating under a continuing resolution, and will still be operating under that until at least March 11th. What this means is the agencies relying on appropriated funds to start new projects can't do that. No new project starts when you need appropriated funds and are operating under a continuing resolution. That's obviously a huge disadvantage when you have a continuing resolution for about half the fiscal year, as we are right now. If you're an agency that started a project last year or the year before, good news, you can keep doing what you're doing. Otherwise, you can't keep going. You can't do anything new until you have new money. But agencies that have access to non-appropriated money will be able to start some new projects. And indeed, I don't want to paint the impression that nothing's happening in terms of federal business, because it is, but you're not seeing any new project starts, not as much as happening right now as it could be. So next slide. So that's great, Larry. When are we going to get money? Are we going to get money this year? Well, probably. It looks like Congress now has a deal that it's going to enable it to pass one catch-all omnibus, some would say ominous, appropriations measure in early March. which would be great if they would do that. But keep in mind that if Congress passes that bill, say they do it March 11th, then it'll take 4 to 5 weeks for each individual federal office to get its money in its account for the remainder of the fiscal year. So, look at about April 15th, ironically, tax day, for when your customer might actually get money in its spending account. And then obviously it's going to be a wild ride. Just because Congress is 6 months late in having appropriations take effect doesn't mean we get any extra time added to the back of the fiscal year. It's going to be an incredibly busy last half of the year, even more so than normal. I will tell you right now, I don't think that federal agencies will be able to get all of the money appropriated, obligated against contracts. There just isn't going to be enough time. So make sure that you're prepared. Next. So look, in a typical year, which this is not, agencies really spend a lot of their money in August and September anyway. That's really going to be especially the case this year, with September being the single largest month of contract actions any time of the fiscal year, right up to and including September 30th, which I think happens to be the longest day of the year, regardless of what the weathermen might say. So your customers are going to need to act fast, which means you're going to need to act fast. You can help yourself and your customer by doing these 3 things. Educating them on small business set-aside rules. Don't take for granted that your customer knows what the small business set-aside rules are. So being able to provide those and just how they can work in their favor, which of course makes it work in your favor, very important. Educating your customer on sole source justification reasons. Again, don't assume that just because everybody's got a copy of the federal acquisition regulations that everybody's up on the small business and sole source justification reasons. Third, if you have access either as a prime contractor or somebody who participates on an indefinite delivery, indefinite quantity contract, you want to make sure that you provide your customers with the step-by-step, easy to use, easy to understand manual on how to make IDIQ buys and how to do it quickly. I find a better educated contractor is the best friend of their government customer. And while these top 2 acquisition methods are very important, particularly to small businesses, it's also the fact that the government does an incredible amount of spending through GSA schedules, through NASA SOUP, through GSA Alliant, and other indefinite delivery, indefinite quantity contracts at the end of the fiscal year. So having access to one of these contracts is really important, particularly if you're in the IT market, where up to 50% of federal IT dollars get spent through these vehicles. Next slide. So let's talk a little bit, that's a little bit of the money, which is always important to the bottom line up front. Let's talk a little bit about the current federal views on small business contracting. Good news, it's generally a good market for small businesses, although a call I had earlier today, not always and everywhere, that's for sure. It's a big government out there. But most agencies support small business contracting, at least as a policy or concept. Keep in mind that your experience may vary. Policy may not always match reality. But most agencies do meet their overall small business use goals. That doesn't mean that they always meet their sub goals. In fact, several federal agencies have had a hard time meeting their women-owned small business and Hubzone goals, in particular over the last couple of years. Also, some people always say, well, the government meets its goal because Lockheed Martin was somehow classified as a small business. That's going to continue to happen for a variety of reasons. The good news is, I think over time, it's happening less and less as government data systems get caught up to current technology and begin to classify things more in real time than they did previously. So the other good news for small businesses is the Biden administration's well-known small minority business goal. Anecdotal evidence suggests that some agencies are already switching their acquisitions to set-asides for small minority businesses. The administration's goal is to increase small minority business contracting by 50% over a specific number of years. So not all this year, but over the next few years, increasing it by 50%. That's a big reach, a big goal, particularly when you consider that the size of the government market will probably be relatively steady to what it was last year. Last year, we had kind of a record-setting year in government procurement from a top-line number. DoD didn't spend as much in the last part of the year, but in FY20 was a banner year. FY21, just a little bit off, but that's really only if you were selling specific weapon systems to Air Force and Navy. Otherwise, you had a good year too, or should have. But the real question I think that we want to ask ourselves about the increase in small minority business contracting is, what's going to be the net effect on the other types of small businesses, women-owned business enterprises, Hubzones, and particularly small disadvantaged and veteran-owned small businesses. SD, VOSBs, and VOSBs have kind of been the flavor of the month for the last several years in small business contracting. Now that may not be so much the case unless you're doing business with the Department of Veterans Affairs. So we're going to have to see if small disadvantaged businesses take up a larger slice of the same sized pie, or if some federal agencies will actually increase the size of their pie of small business opportunities. Next. A quick review of small business classes. These are some of the major small business classes in government procurement, particularly for those of you who are new to government contracting. Jason mentioned in his introduction the 8A program, and Rob has a substantial amount of experience in that. So I'll direct all questions on in-depth to Rob on 8A, but it requires a formal certification from the Small Business Administration. There are certain net worth levels that come into play here for that program that you qualify for only if your net worth is below a certain number. The Hubzones, that's a historically underutilized business zone for people who think that government contracting is just one acronym after another. You're right. In case you never knew what Hubzone stands for, now you do. Specific business and employee location requirements in order to qualify as a Hubzone. That's been a successful program, so successful that some Hubzones are no longer Hubzones, which has caused a bit of an anomaly that the SBA has had to go back and relax some of the rules for Hubzones so that people who were successful don't become victims of their own success and find themselves again at a disadvantage. Women-owned businesses, service-disabled, veteran-owned. The SBA has to review your ownership here in order for you to be properly certified as a service-disabled, veteran-owned small business, just because we like to keep things interesting in government contracting. If you're only claiming veteran-owned small business status, not service-disabled, then the VA will certify you for doing business with the VA as a veteran-owned small business. And then we have Alaska Native corporations and Hawaiian Native businesses. These are potentially big business opportunities. Particularly the Alaska Native program has been very successful over time. It has extraordinary sole source contracting provisions over and above pretty much any other type of government contracting. So if you're not one of these types of businesses and you're interested in an easy to use, very fast way of doing an acquisition, you have to ask yourself about potential partnerships with companies that do have one of these designations. I find that when smaller businesses and new market entries come into the government, they immediately think, I want to sell to the Army. Well, who doesn't? But I think it's good advice to look as equally at partners who already sell to the Army as ways that you can leverage somebody else's expertise and establish some brand name, trust, and reliability through a partner's established positive business reputation. Next slide. So there's also the opportunity for small business subcontracting, or as I like to say it, you don't have to be a prime to star in my show. For those of you who remember 70s and 80s music, you may get the reference. In fact, more and more small businesses are subcontractors to primes than they are prime contractors. And I think that's always going to be the case. There are going to be plenty of companies that do perfectly good government business as subcontractors that may never be a prime contractor. And that's fine. Look, it's a great way to earn while you learn. There are fewer, notice I didn't say none, there are fewer regulatory and contract responsibilities for being a sub than a prime contractor that make it somewhat easier by comparison to be a subcontractor. It's also worth noting that large businesses need to have a small business subcontracting plan. You can see the $750,000 level right there, but it's also the case that any of the companies, large businesses that have one of those indefinite delivery, indefinite quantity contracts, some of them I just mentioned, they all have to have a small business subcontracting plan, all of them. So there are plenty of opportunities for small businesses to do business with larger businesses. My recommendation here is, if you're talking to a partner, lead with your expertise, never lead with your size status. People want to know what makes you special other than whatever socioeconomic designation you might have. Some of these contracts have higher goals than the federal goal. Some subcontracting plans are contract specific, i.e., how is a small business going to directly benefit from the award of this contract to you? Others are more wide ranging. How do the large businesses use small businesses generally? So I think subcontracting is very viable. It's something to definitely look at, particularly it's a low barrier to market entry when you're first coming in. Next slide. So let's look at some of these IDIQ contracts, and these are all great opportunities for small businesses to either prime or be a team member on. By now, we were supposed to have the first part of GSA's Polaris program out, particularly the general small business and women-owned small business pools are supposed to be out by now, GSA. But this is going to be their large information technology services, IDIQ contract. Great opportunity as a small business. It's set aside for small businesses. The other one down the list, GSA's Services Mac. This is going to be their main services IDIQ contract for all types of professional services. It's going to replace the existing OASIS contract. Currently, there is an OASIS unrestricted for businesses of all sizes and a small business companion OASIS contract. Right now, GSA is talking about having one unified Services Mac contract. There's a lot of internal debate inside the agency over that approach. We're going to have to see what they come out with. But the Services Mac for you service providers out there is going to be one of the two main IDIQ contracts for service provision in the market. The other one being GSA's schedule program, the professional services offerings through that schedule. Back to IT, GSA Alliant 2 for businesses of all sizes. doing great work, going gangbusters, so much so that GSA is seeking a ceiling increase on Alliant 2 and also accelerating its planning for Alliant 3. So if you're a small business in the IT world, you can't get on Alliant 2, but you might want to partner with somebody who is. And you definitely want to pay attention now because they're just starting now their groundwork on Alliant 3. So congratulations, you can be in on the ground floor for that contract. Another significant contract that GSA is developing is a cloud blanket purchase agreement. This will be open to companies that have a GSA schedule contract that has cloud capabilities on it. And they want to set up a generic government-wide series of blanket purchase agreements through which federal agencies can buy customized cloud solutions. So if you're in the cloud world, this is something that should be of interest to you. And GSA is definitely looking for ways to have small businesses participate on that BPA. Leaving GSA, we have NIH, the National Institutes of Health, their CISP4 program. Right now, the door is closed on offers for that program. Finally, it's gone under a year's worth of delays that are directly related to protests. Expect post-award protests on this vehicle. And then over the next couple of months, that will certainly delay it further. But eventually, we hope that CISP4 will be up and running and be a health IT flavored contract through which agencies, particularly in HHS, can buy information technology solutions. I left off here, that's a soup, but that's a standalone contract as well. Yes, Jason.
Larry, if I could just ask one question. As we see these staggered dates, like CIOSP4, they're trying to award it now. Alliant 2 is in process. They might raise the ceiling. Planning on Alliant 3 is happening. Like, will the spend shift to CIOSP4 as Alliant 3 goes through its tortured award process? Or does spend typically stay in the vehicles it starts in?
Jason, that's a really excellent question. Typically, we see the spend stay with a vehicle unless one of two things happen. Either there's a substantial delay in getting the follow-on vehicle set up. So remember, there was an Alliance small business contract.
Right.
That crashed and burned. So there was never an Alliant 2 small business. That business had to go somewhere. Some of it went to Main Alliant. Some of it went to other GSA contracts like 8A Stars and the VETS contract that they have. But that's one example of where it wouldn't follow the vehicle. Another would be is if the follow-on vehicle looks dramatically different from the one that it replaced. Look for this potentially to happen between on the transition from Oasis to whatever the Services Mac eventually becomes. The way GSA is planning the Services Mac is it's going to look very, very different from Oasis. And there's an open question as to whether or not business will continue to follow that. So next slide. What's happening with CMMC? This is the Cybersecurity Model Certification Program. It's definitely in flux. Here's what's going on. It's all based on the 17 security practices. The basic one is on 17 basic security practices for the NIST standard SP 800-171. That's why we have a CMMC, because nobody paid attention to NIST standards when they were supposed to. So now we have this annual self-certification for level 1, except there are new requirements now that if you handle controlled unique information, controlled unclassified information, CUI. You will have to go through a formal certification process, even for level 1. Conversely, if all you handle is federal contract information, FCI, you will be able to self-certify. This is for doing business with the Department of Defense only right now, but as always, expect to see something CMMC-like rolled out for DHS and other civilian agencies as this gets up and running. A lot of small businesses, particularly those with a commercial-like background, will be able to do CMMC just for level 1. Many of your systems may already meet a lot of those requirements. It's worth looking at the NIST standard to find out. If you're going to be doing more complex work, or if you're going to be prime contracting, DoD may want you to do level 3, which means more certifications. I was wondering what's happening with the rollout for the rulemaking on this, which has been vastly delayed. And the answer is DoD isn't ready yet to come out with final rules. They're still contemplating what it is they want and where the goalposts should be exactly. Expect more agencies to implement cyber supply rules, particularly under supply chain risk management. That's become an increasing topic in government over the last 6 to 9 months. So it could be coming soon to a contract near you. Next slide. So tying it all together, federal business is good business for those that know how. And what I mean by know how, it's equal parts people who know the rules and regulations, but also people who are capable of developing good business relationships. This really very much is a relationship-driven business, and one that is very risk averse. So you have to keep that in mind. Patience is a necessity. Everybody knows the 24-month-old overnight success story, right? There are very few overnight success stories. If you're one, congratulations. Otherwise, patience is a virtue. So too, by the way, is a sense of humor. That really helps in this market. And you need to ask yourself whether or not your company has or will commit the time and resources to making it work. The most successful businesses here, regardless of size, are the ones who have both feet in the federal market, and as opposed to 1 foot in and 1 foot out. So you don't want to be one of those companies. You want to ask yourself, do we have the time? Do we have the resources? Will we make the commitment? And if the answer to those questions are yes, then great, give it a go. But remember that as good as federal business is, and it can be very good indeed, it's not always a good fit for everyone. Thank you.
And so I just want to say that, you know, a lot of companies ask, like, oh, what does it take to be successful in this federal market? Like Larry Allen just told me. These are the things. And digging into these things is what's required. And it's not easy or pretty or fun all the time. I mean, who isn't excited talking about federal budget appropriations? But it will give you a great opportunity for success. And so, Rob, I want to give you a chance to respond, but I wanted to throw in one more thing, which I think we hear a lot about, which is category management. And we've heard about category management and strategic sourcing for a long time. I think sometimes people in federal don't realize that these are sourcing practices that come from the private sector. Companies have used these very effectively without having to navigate the web of bureaucracy and regulation that's involved in federal. Sometimes also there's the misbelief that the federal government is one entity buying, when in fact it's a fragmented spend category. And what we're seeing now with category management, which is really about categorizing various spend and then applying techniques to negotiate the price, whether those be leveraging economies of scale to bring down unit pricing, whether those be working more closely with your vendors so that your vendors are improving their responsiveness in your supply chain. It can be a number of a number of techniques, but in federal, I think what we often talk about is these strategic sourcing vehicles. And there's been kind of a conflict between strategic sourcing and category management in small business. And Rob, I know that you have dealt with this for a long time, and I'm very interested in your perspectives, and then also in your perspectives about the status of the small business programs that Larry talked about.
Sure. Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. Try and keep it as non-bureaucratic as possible. I've been doing 8A stuff since I've been 15 years old. I worked for one of the first 8A companies who was friends with SBA's general counsel. So I went to law school, and then I went to SBA headquarters. I was supposed to be there for only 2 years, and then I was going to go be a contractor. I ended up writing some 8A regulations in 1990, which are still in effect today. And then I wrote the tribal regulations as well. I left SBA after 10 years, and then I operated 16 8A Hubzone and women-owned companies, had my own 8A company. So I have a weird kind of background in that the only thing that I do well is the 8A program. So, but I've had an opportunity to write the rules. I had the opportunity to live under the rules. And then from 2017 to 2020, I went back and I actually ran these programs for the United States. And so when I went there, you know, we've been working under rules that for probably the last 20, 24 years had been in effect. That, you know, my joke to people is what do you have other than your spouse? What do you have that's 25 years old that still works as well today as it did back then, right? Other than your spouse. And so we set out, we looked at the market when I was there. In my role at SBA, the short version is that my job was to make sure that 23% of the government money was spent with small businesses. And when we first went there, one of the big elephants in the room was category management. Category management, in my opinion, had the effect, everybody could see it, is that the government in general is motivated, particularly with small business and small business utilization, in hitting targets and goals. So the general job for SBA in that regard was to make sure that the government spent at least 23%. With my background in sales and in business development, I treated it like a sales organization. We unified the processes. We added formalization to the women-owned program. We convinced the VA to give us their certification program. We tried to unify all of the processes together so that we could bring in more small businesses into the sector. But the big bad wolf, the elephant in the room, was category management, which was going to have the effect of consolidation. And consolidation generally means that small businesses are going to be squeezed out. So what we first tried to do was get small businesses exempted from category management, and the answer was no. The answer was go back to your office. You're going to be there for a year as a political, wave your flag, and then go get a better job. And so the problem is that this is the only thing that I know how to do, so I stayed for the 4 years. And what we ended up doing was changing rules that, you know, we foresaw what was happening with category management, and we tried to make rules within SBA that could help small businesses to fight back. So in terms of category management, you know, people hear the term, and Larry did a great job in explaining the landscape, but what does it look like? Category management looks like Oasis. It looks like STARS 3. It looks like CIOSP4. It will look like Polaris. The challenges, as people can figure out, is that the problem with category management for the typical small business is that a small business, in order for the government to hit a goal, they would take contracts from small businesses, place them into these larger best-in-class vehicles for which the contractor who had lost the contract no longer could participate because they don't qualify. So we changed some rules. I like to try to give in these type of education sessions, I'm going to give a couple of little bits of information that are important. One of them is 13 CFR 125.8. That's 13 CFR 125.8. That rule basically says that is one of the biggest things that we did. It quickly allows small businesses potentially who have lost contracts to category management to quickly team with more capable small businesses, form a team, and now they can ostensibly qualify for things like OASIS, STARS 3, CIOSP 4, and Polaris. Okay, these are as Larry said, these are 10-year vehicles. If you don't get on them, you may be shut out of part of the sector. And we thought that that was patently unfair. And without, when we had talked about exemptions to category management, we talked to the White House, we talked to Congress, we talked to all the federal agencies, talked to DOD in particular and GSA. And so these rules were crafted so that they could be used government-wide. So that's one of the I think that's one of the things I'm most proud about doing is changing joint venture mentor protege rules. You can look at, again, 13 CFR 125.8, and it allows you to rapidly form a team that can allow you to bid on these category management rules. What's been really cool, and credit to the Biden administration, is that on December 2nd of 2021, here's another number, look up this OMB executive order from the president, and that's the number is M as in Mary -22-03. This is very cool. They succeeded where we had not. And the Biden administration, that was the executive order that comes out, and it raises the limits for small disadvantaged businesses for 8 days. But more importantly, in my opinion, it also specifically exempts small businesses from category management. The weird way that the government will talk about it is that it will give, as of October 1st of 2021, it'll give agencies automatic credit towards agency category management goals for all awards made to certified and self-certified socioeconomic small businesses. In a word, that means 8A certifications. One of the other things that's in this executive order is that it specifically tells the agencies not to prioritize spending in best-in-class vehicles over the certified small businesses. What I predict will be the effect is that small businesses will no longer have their contracts taken away. In fact, the government, the contracting officers will know that as long as I keep it with the small business, I can count that towards the category management goal. Okay, so those are the two most important things I'd probably talk about in terms of the effects on small business with category management. Also, I'd say that Larry touched on this. There's an 11% goal for 8As starting in 2021, and in fact, this goal is usually hit at 11% by small business. Just to give you some numbers, when I first got into office in 2017, the previous high amount spent with small businesses was 99 billion. After some of the changes we made in 2017, there was we set a new historical record of 105 billion. The next year after that, we set it at 120 billion. The next year after that was 134 billion. And in 2020, I think it was 100 and trying to think. It was 100. I think it was about 100 and I think it was about 140 billion. So and then if you add to that about another 90 to 100 in subcontracting, you have almost $250 million, $250 billion being spent with small businesses. But to give you an idea, in 2020, the total amount spent by the government was 560 billion. 57 billion alone went to 8A companies. Okay. And so that's certainly a great pool of money to take a look at. Again, if you add that to the total prime and sub, again, you have around 250 billion that's being spent. So one of the growth strategies I would say is, if you, Larry made a great point, be armed with the rules, but using 125.8, not only can you form contracts or form joint ventures and teaming agreements with companies that help you to be more qualified. Those are the things that the government wants to see. As we say it a little bit differently here, but we say, don't lead with your tag. Lead with your qualifications. The key to selling anything, in my opinion, is solving a problem that your client knows it has. And all of this information is public information, and you have to just do the work, but the work is out there. The pool is much bigger than it was a couple of years ago. It will continue to be large, and now you have the tools to form the teams that you want. And also you have the same rules with the executive order to keep the contracts that you have, and also know that this is one of the more prominent acquisition goals that the government has. And so reminding your contracting officers that these goals are still out there, they have grown, and that you have the capability to not only solve the technical solution, but also the acquisition solution. There's never been a better time to be a small business government contractor.
And Rob and Larry, I don't want to get too down the rabbit hole in the theory of how category management works, but it would seem to me that simply managing the spend that's running through strategic sourcing vehicles without looking at prices paid, or, I mean, where is the effectiveness from this versus just all of the compliance rules?
So at least from some of my research, Jason, I think that the government has probably saved, at the time period I looked at, this is about a year or two ago, they've saved roughly about $11 to $15 billion a year with category management. So it's certainly doing its job.
Okay.
When we looked at it, we said, we only represent 23% of the market. And this is a new program. And if you've worked with government before, they don't always get it right in the beginning. So I was always advocating for, take the efficiencies out of the 77%, leave the 23% alone.
Well, right. And I think, but Jason, I think your question is a good one. Who gets to decide what best means, really? That industry would argue, large parts of industry that argue that the definition of best is somewhat subjective and is tilted more towards low price than anything else. That's going to be an ongoing discussion. What's interesting to me is that category management has survived across 3 different administrations now from both political parties. So it's clearly a management concept that has taken hold.
Okay. It's interesting to me to see best-in-class vehicles that are moving to a highest, like technically acceptable with no pricing except for sole source T&M. So we've removed pricing from the contract, but now we're saying it's a best-in-class vehicle that's going to drive down price.
Well, the idea though with best in class was to drive out competition, right? And that was the react, right? And, to me, at least, I've always been an advocate for small business. At the end of the day, small businesses are by definition, they're inefficient. They're new, right? Right. But so I think that, again, this is a good idea for the more robust and to be overly general. This is good for large businesses. This is for the 77%, but just exempt the 23%. Again, we're already in a minority. And here's the challenge too, is that one of the sobering facts was that you had 30% less small businesses over a 10-year period. And we're having, the base is eroding. At the end of the day, if you looked at how the Small Business Administration came into being, it was simply because we had an eroding industrial base in the 50s. And so that's really still the mission of the agency today. But, now I think even with the ability to team, through the amended joint venture and through the changes to category management, I think that the competition in general is just going to be much sharper. The market of businesses, I can give my own history. When I worked with an 8A company in the 70s, they were used almost as an auxiliary or as a tool for the government contracting officer. And, literally in my uncle's company, we were one of 4 companies in the DC area that provided office machinery and furniture. And there were only 4 companies. And SBA would call and say, we have an agency that has a requirement. How much of this requirement can you fulfill? And if you can't fulfill all of it, we'll go to the next guy and the next guy. Well, then now that concept doesn't work when there's hundreds, if not thousands of those companies that are here. So then it went to typical bidding, but at some point people are going to say, it's like, hey, shouldn't we be more efficient? I mean, it's a good idea, but it's probably the idea of category management, my opinion, is similar like giving an adult dose of medicine to a child.
Right. Larry did a great job covering the various socioeconomic statuses. But I've noticed some trends. One seems to be a move away from self-certification. Another one seems to be, we've seen changes in the 8A program with COVID. A lot of businesses got an extra year. On Hubzone, they froze the maps. I mean, are there any tea leaves to read from these about potential changes to those programs? And where are we with, requiring not self-certification for woman-owned small?
So I think that, we, at least when I was there, we attempted to patch up all of those holes. We tried to make the 8A, the Hubzone program less punitive. It was, we're penalizing companies for being successful. We made it easier to get into the program and to stay in the program. The WASB program, we turned it into a formal certification, and the CVE program, again, we're consolidating with our programs. The goal is to reduce fraud. Call me crazy, but when the government gives out a lot of free stuff, guess what? Sometimes people lie. So we're trying to weed that out and make it easier, more attractive for people to come into the industry, but also try to improve their ability to focus on the fact that you have to push your quality. You can't just push your tag. I mean, here's another sobering thought. When I was there, the last time I was there, we had roughly 75,000 SBA certified businesses. And I'm going to say roughly 2/3 of them were not business ready. Okay. And so being a small business is more than a certification. Here's one of the things that we've tried to do to it's almost like forcing small businesses or forcing children to eat their vegetables. We had a joint venture rule. And one of the things that we used to have, here was the game that people would play. If this is all of small business with a joint venture, half of it, the joint venture could subcontract out 50% of the joint venture to somebody else. A lot of times they would team with a large business. And the only reason the large business in the old days would team with this small business is if the large business was getting this 50% subbed out to them. So the large business would take most of that contract. We changed that rule now so that if you sub out this 50%, of the other 50%, the small business has to self-perform 40% of any portion that the two partners do. It's a little bit of a complicated rule, but it's effectively changed the way that large and small businesses have teamed around the Beltway since 2020. So if you're using, literally, if you're using a teaming strategy that you've used prior to 2020, you better check the rules again, because I'm pretty sure it doesn't work now. But by the same token, it's requiring small businesses not just to be able to team, but they actually have to self-perform. And that's the only way that you're going to get better businesses. And I think that in general, my mission has always been get government to see SBA certified companies as their best option to achieve mission. But the only way you're going to do that is if they actually self-perform.
And increasingly, SBA is doing the certifications.
Yes.
Or is that not like with SDVOSB?
Yes, they will end up doing all of the certifications. I suppose that if the next administrator could ostensibly now look at GCBD, my old division, and use that as the national certifier for diversity supply. But in doing that, the challenge the agency has now is that most of their resources are still going to PPP and EIDL. And the challenge that we have with processing is there's limited funds to go toward adding staff, and there's limited funds to go towards automation that will help the staff to do the processing faster. My own personal experience, here with the Miami tribe, and also when I was a consultant, is that the processing is slowing down. It's getting better. It's letting the right companies in more, but at the end of the day, speed is what what our constituents want to have. So best thing I could say is make your teams early and look forward, get your applications in earlier. So.
Nice, excellent. So I did want to talk a little bit briefly about protests. I don't know that there was a ton of news in 2021 on protests. I know there was a lot of back and forth on the blue and gold rule, which is a very esoteric topic we won't get into here. But I think one of the interesting things was the protests fell 12%. There were a couple things that I've heard. One is that there was so much COVID money that people maybe didn't feel the need to file as many protests. And then the other thing I heard was perhaps enhanced debriefings out of DOD, by which the DFAR, I believe, has been modified to specify what needs to be included in a debriefing. Maybe that is helping to decrease the number of protests. One thing that I saw and I wasn't aware of before was that there was the first protest filed, Oak Grove Tech, where GAO found that DOD did not engage in mandatory discussions. Discussions or negotiations apparently are mandatory in DOD above $100 million. I did want to back up a little bit on protests and kind of, because I know we hear a lot about them, and I don't know that people always understand what they mean, or that they can in fact mean three things. A protest is essentially an unsuccessful offerer or an unsuccessful bidder suing the government and saying they didn't like some aspect of the decision. And that disagreement can take place directly with the agency, which is the easiest to file and doesn't even require an attorney. It can take place with the Government Accountability Office, which is a branch of Congress, which is the easier of the next two paths, the cheaper, and comes with an automatic stay, so that the company who was awarded the work will generally get a stop work order to not continue performing. And then there's a Court of Federal Claims, which is an actual court, and which requires much more formal procedures, and protests are much more expensive. So if you don't like what the GAO tells you, you can always go to the Court of Federal Claims. But I think when we talk about protests generally, we're usually talking about GAO because that's the most popular protest form. One interesting thing to note about GAO is that the agencies actually aren't legally bound to file GAO's decisions. The agencies follow GAO's decisions because GAO is an arm of Congress, and Congress can force compliance. So generally, we talk about GAO bid protests because they're the easiest and because there's an automatic stay in performance. One of the things that we have seen on very large contracts is sometimes an incumbent will automatically file a protest just to continue their performance and capture that additional revenue. Sometimes I look at publicly traded companies and it almost seems like fiduciary irresponsibility on the part of CAO not to grab an extra 3 months of revenue when they are going to lose the contract. So the protest grounds this year were largely the same as they were in prior years. Unreasonable technical evaluation, which is usually code for the government stated an evaluation criteria and then proceeded not to follow it. What it does not mean is I didn't like how the government evaluated my proposal, but that they misevaluated your or other proposals in a unequal way. Flawed discussions. Discussions are the code word for negotiations, which don't, in my mind, happen nearly enough in government. When I have a plumber come into my house, I like to talk to them. I don't just want to exchange bid sheets and then sign a contract. But because discussions are fraught with protest grounds, in my experience, agencies are hesitant to engage in them. And the fact that they're the second most common protest grounds kind of speak to why agencies shy away from that. And then the third, which is the same in similar years, was unreasonable cost or price evaluation. I think cost or price evaluations are much more common on cost type contracts, which probably affect our audience less. And then, so the other thing that we've, so I don't know, Larry, Rob, any thoughts on protest grounds or reading the tea leaves for protesting going forward?
One of the things, Jason, I think that's important to look at in protests is while the overall number falls, when you file a protest, you have to understand what it is you're asking for. Are you asking for GAO to completely overturn the acquisition decision the agency made, or are you looking for them to take some remedial step? Well over 40% of the time, a GAO protest results in an agency taking some proactive remedial action so that the protester, in essence, gets to live to bid again another day on that opportunity. And look, if that's going to happen over 40% of the time, if you've spent $500,000 or $600,000 putting together a bid package and you put in a lot of time, and you know you can do a pretty good GAO protest for about $30,000 to $35,000, why wouldn't you have the agency take another look and give yourself an opportunity to bid again, knowing more than you did going in? So I think we're going to continue to see that. Even if the overall number of protests fall, people are going to, want to have that second chance.
Excellent. And one of the other notable things that we saw with a whimper, I guess you could say, is the Jedi Procurement. And I know it was very high profile and very specific. To provide some background, the Department of Defense decided to go with a single award IDIQ contract, meaning winner takes all for cloud, which was protested basically by every company who felt like they did not have a good shot at winning it, some of whom legitimately didn't have a good shot at winning it. And finally, after numerous protests, DoD caved and is moving to a multi-award solution. Do you think this speaks to the fact that it is extremely difficult to do single award in government, or is it more the specifics of this case?
I think it's hard to do a single award for this. I think the Defense Information Systems Agency set themselves up to fail by choosing a single award approach. And it was interesting that industry telegraphed their intent to fight this all the way, and yet DoD continued on with the single award acquisition And it was kind of surprising to me to see that companies spent, in one case, millions of dollars to fight this, even though they really weren't ever going to be one of the ones in the competitive range. And ultimately, DoD caved. They would have saved themselves a lot of time, and they would have saved companies a lot of money if they had done a multiple award approach to begin with. So I think it's kind of ironic, but not at all surprising. You know, back, I think, I don't want to speak for Rob, but I know generally when I started in this business, which was Rob had been in it by then, single awards were a lot more prevalent in federal government acquisition. So to me, this was kind of an anachronistic decision.
All right, excellent. So it seems like we have been in, and I know a number of companies have GSA schedules. It feels to me like we've been in a GSA schedule transition for the past 5 years, and we're still somewhere in that transition. What should contractors be on the lookout for as far as schedule consolidation? Is that wrapping up? Is the reconfiguration of the schedules nearly complete?
So yeah, I would say a couple of things. It is nearly complete, Jason. The consolidation project itself is into the phase now where it's only a real factor if you have more than one scheduled contract. GSA is in the process of merging those contracts with some exceptions, strictly due to timing. But they're in the process of merging those contracts into one. So if you had 2 or 3, now you're gonna have one master schedule with all of the components under the big umbrella. Industry doesn't get to pick its contracting officer, which I think is unfortunate. On the other hand, that does say that I think almost every contractor would end up with an IT contracting officer, and that's not realistic to expect either. There are only so many of them to go around. I think, you know, I think the big thing that is going on in schedules land right now is GSA is requiring all of its contractors to have a facility on their websites to track where an order is, track what the order status is on an order. And if you don't have order status tracking, they're threatening to kick you off of Advantage, but they're also threatening to kick you off of GSA eBuy, which is a much bigger deal. So if you're a company that has a GSA schedule, you want to make sure that you've got an order tracking capability or can implement one on a fairly short horizon. Otherwise, you can miss some of that end of year eBuy business, which I think can be good business for contractors.
And is that primarily a concern for product vendors?
Well, I think it is. You know, I doubt that you're going to be able to have a lot of order status tracking for professional service companies, although maybe. But I know that GSA Advantage, to the extent that it's a big deal for scheduled contractors, it's more of a big deal for product companies than service companies, even though you're all contractually obligated to have a robust and updated GSA Advantage listing. I would also say that companies of all types get themselves in trouble when their schedule pricing changes, but they don't make a timely adjustment to their Advantage pricing. Counts are numerous when that has come back to bite a company.
Right. Excellent. And one thing that I wanted to dig into a little bit further was, because we're rapidly coming up on end of year and there is this surplus of money, there, you know, like the government isn't going to buy a massive systems implementation on September 3rd. You know, so there is kind of a of when you start to try to close out projects that may require a technical evaluation versus maybe they need to buy a bunch of laptops. Is there, do you kind of have a timeline for tracking channels and types, or is it pretty much a free-for-all and they can award complex technical services within a day.
I think, Jason, we're going to see this year as much elasticity as the contracting officer is comfortable with. I've talked to some of my colleagues in the assisted acquisition world, and they usually have earlier cutoff dates than a regular contracting shop might. They're being flexible with those cutoff dates. Why they have to be, because the money just wasn't there when it usually is. So I think that the trick is obligation. When are the funds being obligated? Do we have a specific project to which they will be obligated, which you better have? But I think that there's going to be some flexibility here. It used to be that the last couple of days of the fiscal year, all you really saw were onesie twosie buys and maybe some end of the year furniture acquisitions. But now I have clients that are in the services world, and they say it's busy for them right up until the very end. So I think, and some of those can be pretty complex on their own. So I think that's what we're going to see. We're going to see more complex buying get done later in the fiscal year.
All right. Excellent. Rob, we had an audience question, which I think you can probably answer, around using the CMS Spark contract vehicle to freeze businesses' 8A status to make sole source awards on the contract. Is that allowable?
I'm not familiar with CMS Spark, but I'll tell you that if you'd like to send me the question, if you have a pen, 301-996-8696, text me the question. I'll get an answer for you.
Sure. Yeah, it is like an IDIQ. I mean, I do remember that GSA used stars to hold 8A status, and then I think you could do a sole source off of it. Even after the business had graduated from like a SAM registration.
Generally, it's going to be 5 years. Yeah, we SBA has a rule now that if the old days, on the last day of your 8A eligibility, if you were awarded CMS Spark and it was a 10-year contract, then you could continue to get CMS Spark contracts for 10 years. There's a rule that SBA has now that just says that at 5 years, whether the government asks for it or not, you have to recertify.
Recertify, and then you're no longer in 8A.
Correct.
Okay, excellent. Well, I want to thank you both for a lively discussion. I thought we could kind of end with predictions for the end of the year, although I'm sure anything can certainly happen. I think whenever there's a bunch of money spent, we can imagine that the overseers are going to identify fraud, and there's going to be the corresponding pushback against whatever type of spending that fraud was used. I'm interested in hearing what you're looking for in 2022.
My personal feeling of the last couple of years, don't forget J&As. The challenge the government has is it has so much money and it's coming out so late that, again, keep sticking with pushing the solutions, to problems that the government knows it has. And if you can't make a team with a qualified partner in time, and this is particularly, you're going to see this with a lot of the category management vehicles. SBA isn't processing, they're not doing size determinations or eligibilities or joint ventures or mentor proteges fast enough. But I think that if you can still put together a team and if you can present the best solution, don't forget that at the end of the year, a lot of the people that I knew were successful with J&A, even if they were not otherwise certified as a small business. There's just too much money and not enough time.
What is that? Like, how much time should a business allot for a J&A?
For me, I tend to, when we put bids in, or if I have a client that put bids in, we give all of those things, as you had said earlier, like a Chinese menu.
Sure. Okay.
Here are the ways to get to us, right? You've got to put almost as much time in the acquisition solution as you do with the technical. But I still think that technical carries the day.
That's excellent advice. Thank you. Larry, any predictions?
I think Rob's absolutely right. You have to be able to answer the how question. How do I get to you? And it's always good to have a couple of avenues for how a customer can get to you. Very important to have more than one, I think. The other thing that I would say, Jason, you're absolutely right. I think Congress will probably go so far as to have oversight hearings on why agencies misspent things in FY22, missing the irony that they were a large part of the reason why. But we're also, for OIG, the Inspector General, absolutely a factor. I had a colleague of mine told by Region 2 contracting officer, I think it might have been you, that the OIG factors large in agency decisions. Contractors think that the Inspector General is only out to get them, but in fact, they're also out to provide oversight internally to contracting officers. That can definitely have an impact on how things get done and the pace of business and the amount of flexibility you have in conducting that business. But I think we'll have a fun year. This is a year to be ready. It's a year to have good partners, and vehicles matter.
Excellent. Excellent. I really want to thank both Larry and Rob. Thank you so much for joining. Thank you, everybody who joined. Thank you all. I believe the association will make the presentation available as well as the recording. I really appreciate everybody's time.
Thank you for having us.